Camera 6 came up, and I felt my hand stop on the panel. The control room was cold enough that the plastic buttons felt slick under my fingers. Behind me, the radio kept giving off that thin bed of static that had been sitting there all night. Camera 7 had shown the path climbing toward Tower 2. Gravel, a strip of service road, and the usual dead stretch of dark where the floodlight fell off. Then, Camera 8 showed a shape standing at the tower base. Not clear enough to make out, just wrong in a way I couldn't place yet. I switched back through the next feed because that was the order. Same shape, new angle, farther along the route than it should have been, like it had covered ground in the second it took me to hit one button. That was when I stopped thinking it was moving around the station. It wasn't following me. It was getting ahead of me. I didn't know then how far ahead of me it already was. The first night started with a drive up into western North Carolina. I took the turn off the Blue Ridge Parkway a little before sundown, and within 10 minutes I could already feel the road changing under the truck. The pavement got narrower, the shoulder got meaner, the guardrails showed up in short stretches, then disappeared again like somebody had run out of budget halfway through the climb. My phone dropped to 1 bar, then none. I checked it twice anyway, out of habit more than anything, then tossed it on the passenger seat and kept going. The road kept gaining elevation in a way that didn't feel dramatic until I looked over and saw how far the trees fell away below me. Western North Carolina can do that to you. 1 minute you're driving through something that feels ordinary enough, and the next minute the light's going out early because the mountain is already in the way. The sky still had color in it, but not much of it was making it down to the road. I'd been awake too long. That was part of it. I'd spent the first half of the day moving what little I had out of Wayne's place and into the truck bed. Just clothes, a toolbox, a couple plastic bins, a coffee maker, and the duffel I never really unpacked anymore. Wayne had stood in the driveway and helped me load without saying much. He was good like that. He never made a thing harder than it already was. That wasn't the problem. The problem was the house had stopped feeling like a favor and started feeling like I was wearing out my welcome one meal at a time. Nobody had to spell that out for me. You hear enough low voices through a kitchen door, you get the point. So no, I hadn't taken the Cold Branch job because I'd always dreamed of babysitting radio equipment on a mountain ridge at night. I took it because the posting came with a utility cabin on site. It had power, running water, a heater that supposedly worked, and a door I could close without wondering if somebody on the other side wished I wasn't there. That was enough for me. The last mile was a service road cut straight into the ridge, loose gravel, potholes, mud dried into hard ruts. The truck bounced hard enough to make my thermos knock against the floorboard. Then I came around one final bend and saw the station. First thing I saw was the fence line, chain link, topped with wire, running around the whole compound in a rough square. After that came the towers, 3 of them, black against what was left of the sky, spaced far enough apart to make the place feel bigger than it was. Then the control building, low and rectangular, with 2 exterior lights over the door. Off to the side sat the cabin that came with the job, small, prefab, pale in the failing light, with a short set of steps and 1 narrow porch rail. Nothing special. Still looked better than anything I'd had in a while. I parked near the building and cut the engine. When the truck went quiet, I could hear the wind moving over the ridge and a faint hum from the station itself. Not loud, just steady. The kind of sound working equipment makes when it's been on longer than you've been there and doesn't care if you understand it. The door to the control building opened before I reached it. A man stepped out carrying a clipboard under one arm. He was older than I expected, somewhere in his 60s maybe, lean in the shoulders, work jacket zipped all the way up. He didn't move slow exactly. He moved like somebody who had been doing the same job long enough to stop wasting motion. "You made decent time," Burke said. "Road was clear," I said. He gave one short nod and stepped aside to let me in. The control room was warmer than outside, but only by enough to notice it. One wall was all monitors. Another held racks of equipment with little status lights blinking green and amber. There was a radio console, a logbook, a stainless travel mug with the finish worn off near the handle, and a smell in the room that took me a second to place. Old coffee, warm dust, and that dry electric smell you get around equipment that never really shuts off. Burke set the clipboard down, then stood facing the monitor wall for a second longer than he needed to. He didn't look confused. He looked like he was checking for something and not seeing it yet. Then he turned back to me and started walking me through the room in a voice so even it almost made me relax. Almost. He showed me the radio console first, then the camera layout, then the printed checklists, the time blocks, the reset schedule, the route map for the outdoor rounds. He knew where every switch was without looking, knew which cabinet stuck if you pulled too fast, knew which camera lagged half a beat when the temperature dropped. None of that felt strange. If anything, it made me feel better. Men like that kept places running. It was only when he stopped beside the console and rested one hand near the panel that the feeling shifted a little. Not enough to call it fear. Not yet. Just enough for me to notice that he was still watching the monitors while he talked, like part of him was waiting for one of them to do something he didn't want to see. Burke didn't hand me everything at once. He walked me through the station the way you show a man a job you expect him to keep, not a place you're trying to impress him with. That mattered to me. If he tried to sell it too hard, I probably would have trusted it less. The control room was the center of it. That was where the radio console sat, where the monitor wall ran in two neat rows, where the logbook stayed open on the desk beside the printed checklist. Every shift lived or died in that room first. The rest of the station was just what the room reached out to touch. He showed me the camera order before anything else. There were outside feeds first, then the building angles, then the access road, then the tower bases. You didn't just click around and look wherever you felt like looking. Burke moved through them in the same order every time, with 2 fingers on the panel and his eyes already on the next screen before the current one changed. Camera 1 was the front gate and the stretch of fence nearest the road. Camera 2 covered the side of the control building and the path to the cabin. Camera 3 gave you the lower slope near Tower 1. Camera 4 was the service road bend below it. Camera 5 caught the fence line on the far side. Camera 6 showed the gravel near the generator shed. Camera 7 picked up the path climbing toward Tower 2. Camera 8 was the tower base itself, plus a slice of dark beyond the floodlight. After that came the interior feeds, the hallway, the entry door, the equipment room, and a narrow view of the back steps. It sounded simple when he said it. It looked simple when he did it. I knew jobs like that. Most of them were only simple because somebody else had been doing them long enough to make them look that way. "You'll get used to the order," Burke said. "That's what I'm counting on," I said. He didn't smile at that. He just moved on. Top of every hour, there was a radio check. Same call, same response, same time block entered into the logbook after. Every hour. No skipping it because the weather was bad, or because the station felt quiet, or because you got distracted halfway through something else. At 2:15 a.m., there was a signal reset. Not a full shutdown, just a short, controlled cycle that pushed the system through a check and brought the feeds back in sequence. That went in the logbook, too. Every round outside had its own line on the checklist, and every line had a box next to it that Burke marked with a pressure that almost tore the paper. The outside route mattered just as much as the inside work. He showed me the map first, then walked me through it with a flashlight and a ring of keys. Out the control building door, down the short concrete path. First stop, Tower 1. After that, the fence gate on the north side, then the generator shed, then Tower 2. Always that order, always the same loop back. He didn't dress it up like some sacred thing. He just repeated it until I said it back to him without looking at the map. Tower 1 sat lower on the ridge than the others, with a patch of packed gravel around the base and a set of guy wires that hummed faintly in the wind. The fence gate was farther than it looked from the building, mostly because the ground dropped off unevenly and forced you to watch your step in the dark. The generator shed was a cinder-block box with a steel door and a smell like oil that never really left the air around it. Tower 2 stood farthest out, where the ridge narrowed and the wind hit harder. From there, even in the dying light, you could tell how little there was around us. Trees, slope, darkness waiting its turn. The utility cabin sat close enough to the control building that you could make the walk in less than a minute, which mattered more to me than I wanted to admit. It wasn't much. One room, one bathroom, a narrow bed, a table bolted to the wall, and a heater that clicked when it kicked on. But it was mine for as long as I had the job. That was the part I kept coming back to. Mine for as long as I had the job. Wayne had never been the problem. I want that clear. He'd let me stay without making me ask twice. He'd cleared a space in the hall closet. He'd told me to take the room at the back of the house and stay until I got on my feet. He meant it when he said it. But there's only so long you can live inside somebody else's marriage before you start hearing the strain you're putting on it, even when nobody says your name to your face. A plate set down too hard in the sink. A pause when you walk into the kitchen. Low voices after midnight. Once, I heard Wayne's wife say I was supposed to be there a few weeks, not half the summer. She wasn't wrong. That was the worst part. She wasn't wrong, and Wayne didn't have an answer for her because neither did I. So when Burke showed me where the spare blankets were in the cabin and where to reset the breaker if the heater tripped, I had a hard time pretending that wasn't the best part of the whole job. The station itself was just work. The cabin was what made the work matter. Back in the control room, Burke showed me how to write each entry the same way every time. Time first, event second. No extra notes unless something actually needed documenting. Keep the handwriting readable. Don't leave blanks you meant to fill later. Don't trust yourself to remember what happened at 3 a.m. once it was daylight. That part I understood right away. Night work will make you think you'll remember things you won't. By then, the last of the daylight was gone from the windows in the outer door. The monitor wall looked brighter. The room looked smaller. The radio gave off that low, steady hiss again. Burke checked the time, then the cameras, then the checklist. Same order, same motion. Watching him do it, I had the first real thought I'd had all evening that felt close to hope. If I could learn this rhythm and keep it, then maybe I could keep the rest of it too. The room, the cabin, the door that locked behind me. Maybe that was all this needed to be. A night shift on a mountain, a stack of routine checks, and enough pay to keep me from going back down that road with my things in the truck, and nowhere better to take them. Because that was the stake, whether I said it out loud or not. If I lost the job, I lost the cabin. And if I lost the cabin, I didn't have anywhere I wanted to go back to. Burke finished the regular handoff before he said anything that made the room feel different. He went line by line through the printed checklist, same calm voice, same pace he'd used for everything else. Radio checks at the top of every hour, camera sweep in order, signal reset at 2:15 a.m., outdoor round after that, log entry after each step, no shortcuts, no filling things in from memory later. He showed me where the spare batteries were, which cabinet held the weather radio, which breaker fed the cabin heater, which exterior light near the generator shed liked to flicker when the temperature dropped. It was all practical, all normal enough. If he'd sent me out the door right then, I probably would have gone into the shift thinking it was just another lonely night job with older equipment and more mountain around it than I was used to. Instead, he looked at the monitor wall one more time, then down at the desk. The clipboard was already there. The logbook was open. A pen sat beside it, set square with the edge of the page. Burke opened the lower console drawer and took out a folded sheet of paper. It had been folded enough times that the creases had turned pale. He didn't hand it to me right away. He laid the clipboard flat first, like that was still the official thing, then set the folded page beside it. "The stuff on the clipboard keeps the station running," Burke said. He touched the folded page with 2 fingers. He set the folded page beside it. "This keeps you here long enough to finish the shift." I looked at him, then at the paper. It wasn't typed. It wasn't station letterhead. It looked like something somebody had written out by hand, then recopied enough times that the current version had lost whatever first shape it used to have. I started to ask if he was serious, but he was already watching my face in that patient way older men have when they know you're deciding whether to laugh at them. "Don't improvise," he said. That was all. He opened the page himself and turned it so I could read it from where I was standing. 6 lines. Shorter than I expected. No explanations under them. No dates. No names. Just 6 rules, written in a blocky hand that tried hard to stay clear and plain. The first one sat right at the top, like it belonged with the regular job and not off to the side of it. Only answer the radio check after the second beep. I looked at the radio console without meaning to. Burke noticed that. Of course he did. He kept his hand near the panel, not touching anything, just there. It didn't sound impossible yet. That was what got me. If he'd opened with something completely insane, I would have written the whole thing off as some old mountain test for the new guy. But that first one sounded close enough to a quirk of bad equipment that it could slide in under your guard. Maybe there was a delay issue. Maybe there was some old repeater bounce in the system. Maybe he had a reason. Then I looked at the second rule. Follow the outdoor round in the exact order. If you break the order, go back. Don't correct it mid-route. That one bothered me more. Not because it sounded scary, because it sounded annoying. It sounded like the kind of habit an older tech develops and then mistakes for law because he's been doing the job too long to separate routine from personality. Tower 1, fence gate, generator shed, Tower 2. That was the order he'd already drilled into me. I could still see the route map in my head. I could also think of 3 ways to cut a few minutes off it if weather turned bad. He must have seen that thought on my face because he glanced toward the outer door and then back to the page. No speech, no explanation, just that same hard calm. The third rule was next. After reset, if one camera comes back too early, don't hold it longer than 3 seconds. That one landed a little colder. Not because it was dramatic, because it was too specific. 3 seconds wasn't a number somebody guessed at for effect. 3 seconds sounded measured, tried, kept. The monitor wall hummed softly behind us. Somewhere inside the rack cabinets, a fan changed pitch for a second and then settled again. Burke still hadn't started acting like he was telling a ghost story. That helped, and made it worse at the same time. The fourth rule was where the room changed for me. If the next camera feed already shows someone where you haven't gotten yet, don't zoom, don't compare. Write the time down on scrap paper. I read that one twice. Not because I didn't understand it, because I understood it too easily. The next feed. Someone where you haven't gotten yet. That was not a line somebody wrote by accident. That was not broad enough to be superstition. It had shape to it. It had a sequence. It assumed a camera order, a route, a person moving through the shift in a pattern somebody else already knew. I looked over at the row of monitors. They were all showing ordinary things. Fence, gravel, building wall, tower base, empty ground under floodlights. Nothing standing in any of them. Nothing wrong that I could see. But after reading that line, the blank feeds didn't feel blank in the same way. The fifth rule sat right under it. If the figure appears on 2 consecutive feeds in the same sweep, don't go outside for 10 minutes. That was the first time the page used the word figure. Even that felt careful. Not man, not person, not anything too sure of itself, just figure. My first thought was that Burke had to know how crazy this sounded. My second was that he knew exactly how crazy it sounded and had stopped caring whether it did. I didn't ask the question that came up first. I didn't ask what figure. I didn't ask if he'd seen it. I didn't ask how many times. The way he stood there made all of those feel useless before they were even out of my mouth. He watched me read the last rule. If the logbook already contains something in your handwriting that you haven't written yet, fold the page and don't do the next round alone. That one hit harder than the rest, and not in a showy way. It just cut through all the room I'd left myself for explanation. The radio could have interference. The cameras could lag. A route could become ritual if a man worked long enough in one place. But my handwriting was my handwriting. There wasn't a technical version of that. There wasn't a weather version of that. I looked at the logbook on the desk. The page was clean, except for Burke's neat entries from the shift he was finishing. Time, event, initials. The pen beside it suddenly looked like something I shouldn't touch until I had to. Burke folded the paper back once, not all the way shut, then left it open enough that I could still see the top half. He never started telling me what had happened to the last guy. He never said how long the page had been in that drawer. He never gave me any grand line about the mountain or the station or what people out there like to believe. He just stood in the control room with the monitors washing a dull light over the side of his face and let the rules sit between us like they were part of the equipment. That was what made it stick. Not fear, not theater. Just the feeling that this had been added onto the job the same way people add another step to a process after getting burned enough times. I read them again, slower this time. Not because I believed them, not really, but because I could already tell that if I laughed them off and something went wrong later, I'd hear my own voice doing it again in my head. The clipboard was still on the desk, the official one. The one with boxes and timestamps and clean printed lines. The folded sheet sat beside it, smaller, worn, and not official in any way that would have mattered to a company. But Burke had put them down together for a reason. One was how the station ran. The other, apparently, was how a man made it through the night up there. He finally picked up the clipboard again and checked the time. Top of the hour was getting close. The station had already moved on to the next thing, whether I was ready or not. That was the part I kept coming back to later. He never tried to convince me. He never had to. He just gave me the page in the same tone he'd used for everything else. Like after enough nights in that room, the difference between standard procedure and something worse than that had stopped being worth pointing out. The first hour went by clean enough that I started feeling a little stupid for how hard the folded page had landed on me. Burke stayed through the opening stretch of the shift, not because he hovered, but because that was the overlap. He handled his side. I handled mine. The control room stayed warm in that dry, stale way equipment rooms do, and the monitor wall kept washing the desk in that flat blue-white light that makes it hard to tell how tired you are until you stand up too fast. Outside, the mountain had gone fully dark. You could see the fence line under the floodlights, the gravel around the towers, the service road dropping off into black, and then nothing much past that. I kept finding myself looking at the folded page beside the clipboard, not reading it, just checking that it was still there. When the clock in the corner of the monitor wall rolled over to the top of the hour, Burke straightened a little in his chair and looked at the radio console. I already had my hand near the mic. The radio checks were simple enough. Wait for the station cue, answer with the call sign, log the time. Same thing every hour. Then a voice came over the speaker before the tone. Not loud, not distorted enough to sound dramatic. Just a man's voice, flat and close through the static. It used my call sign. I stopped with my fingers resting on the mic button and felt my stomach drop for no good reason I could explain. It wasn't even what the voice said that got me. It was the timing. It came too early, not by much, just enough that I was still waiting for the beep when I heard it. A second later, maybe less, the real tone sounded. I didn't answer the first voice. I didn't answer right away after the beep either. I just looked at Burke. "You hear that?" I asked. Burke kept his eyes on the panel. "Not everything up here is for answering." That was all he gave me. I answered after that. My voice sounded steady enough, and the station returned the check the way it was supposed to. Burke logged the time. The room settled again. The radio went back to that low layer of hiss that almost disappeared if you let it. I told myself it was bleed. Old equipment, some overlap in the system. I'd heard stranger things come through bad radios before. Half a voice from somewhere else, a clipped call, dispatch bouncing wrong off weather, mountains mess with signals. Everybody knows that. I said all that to myself in my head, and none of it sounded great, but it sounded better than standing there with my hand still half curled over the mic like I'd almost done something I wasn't supposed to do. The rest of the hour stayed normal. That was the part that helped the lie along. Burke finished his overlap not long after and got his things together with the same plain movements he'd used all evening. He didn't give me some heavy look on the way out, didn't ask if I was sure I had it. He just left the way a man leaves a place he fully expects to still be there when the next shift comes in. The door shut behind him. His truck started outside a minute later. Then the sound rolled off down the ridge, and I was by myself. That changed the room more than I wanted it to. Not because it became scary right away, it just became mine. The chair, the radio, the monitor wall, the logbook, the heater kicking once in the cabin next door through the quiet. Everything I'd told myself I wanted. A place to work, a place to stay. No one waiting on the other side of a kitchen wall wishing I'd move on already. I kept going. The station settled into its rhythm. Top of the hour passed. I ran the camera sweep in the same order Burke had shown me, slow enough to do it right, fast enough not to start inventing things in the dark patches between the lights. Fence, building, road, shed, tower base, hallway, back steps. Same rotation, same notes, same chair squeak every time I leaned in too far. When 2:15 a.m. came up, I started the reset. That part felt mechanical enough to calm me down. Hands on the switches, eyes on the sequence. Wait for one feed to drop, then the next. Watch them return in order. Write down the time. Move on. Only one of the outdoor feeds came back too early. It was one of the road cameras. I couldn't have said which one now without lying, just that it flashed alive a beat before the others, sharp and sudden, like a light opening in a room where nobody should have been yet. I looked at it because of course I did. Then I remembered the rule and counted in my head without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. I switched off it. I didn't see anything clear in those 3 seconds. Gravel, fence line, maybe the bottom edge of Tower 1 or maybe just shadow. What stayed with me wasn't the image. It was the feeling that I had interrupted something by looking at it too long, even though 3 seconds isn't long at all. After the rest of the feeds returned, I brought the sequence around again, and the camera looked ordinary. Same dead patch of road, same washed-out gravel, same nothing. I sat back and rubbed at my eyes with the heel of my hand. Old system, I told myself. Cold weather. Timing, drift after reset. That actually made sense. More sense than the other option anyway. I made the log entry, kept moving. It was later during another full sweep that I saw the figure. I was far enough into the shift by then that everything had started to feel a little too smooth. The monitor changes. The little push of the button under my thumb, the flick of my eyes from one screen to the next. I was on one of the lower outdoor feeds, looking at a stretch of service road and fence that I knew I'd be walking past later on my outside round. Nothing there. I moved to the next camera because that was the order. And there it was, a shape standing near the tower base, not close enough to make out a face, not sharp enough to call a man. Just something upright where there shouldn't have been anything upright at all. Too still. Too exactly there. What got me wasn't that I was seeing somebody on the property. It was that I knew where that camera sat in the sequence. I knew where that point sat on the route. I hadn't gone outside yet. I hadn't reached that section, but the next feed already looked like it was waiting on me. My finger twitched toward the zoom before I caught myself. Don't zoom. Don't compare. I reached for the scrap paper instead. the one Burke had left by the logbook without comment. I wrote the time down with a hand that felt clumsier than it should have. Then I forced myself to keep moving through the sweep. The next camera showed empty road. The one after that showed the side of the building, then the interior hallway, then the back steps. Same order, same pace. I could feel my pulse in my throat the whole time, not pounding, just there, hard enough to make swallowing feel noticeable. When I finished the full sequence and came back around, the figure was gone. The feed showed the same tower base, same gravel, same ugly edge of light falling off into dark. Nothing standing there, nothing moving away, nothing at all. I stared at it longer than I should have. Then I looked at the scrap paper, at the time I'd written down in my own hand, and then back at the feed. That was the worst kind of thing. Not because it was big, because it wasn't. Because by the time I came back to it, it had already turned into the kind of thing a tired man could talk himself around. Bad feed timing, a branch shadow, a light shift, a trick of distance, mountain wind moving something just right, me needing sleep more than I wanted to admit. I finished the rest of the shift. I did the entries. I checked the doors. I watched the time drag toward morning. Nothing else happened that I could point to and say there that was wrong. When daylight finally started thinning the dark outside the feeds, I was left with one voice I couldn't prove I heard, one camera that came back too early, and one shape that didn't stay long enough for me to make it real. That was what got under my skin about the first night. Not that something impossible happened. It was that by sunrise, I still had just enough room to lie to myself about all of it. Morning up there came in thin. Not warm, not bright in any generous way. Just enough gray leaking through the cabin window to tell me the night was over. I let myself into the cabin and shut the door behind me, then just stood there with one hand still on the knob. The heater had kicked on at some point before I came back down. The place smelled faintly like warm dust and the coffee I'd made too early the day before and never fully finished. There was a folded blanket at the foot of the bed, my duffel on the floor, my boots by the door where I'd kicked them off without thinking. It looked like exactly what I'd wanted. Quiet. Temporary. Mine, as long as I kept the job. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to talk myself back into daylight. None of what had happened the night before felt solid enough to carry out of the dark. That was the problem. It had all been just real enough to stay with me and just thin enough to sound stupid by morning. I told myself I was tired. I told myself the station was old. I told myself I'd gotten into my own head. I said all that to myself while I unlaced my boots, while I washed my face at the little sink, while I stared at my own reflection looking worse than I'd looked the night before. Then I took out my phone. No signal in the cabin. I already knew that. I still looked. For a second, I considered driving far enough back down the road to get one bar and calling Andrew. Just saying it wasn't going to work out, keeping it short, telling him the place wasn't a fit, maybe making up something about the hours or the drive or the equipment being more technical than the listing had made it sound. Anything cleaner than the truth, which wasn't really the truth anyway. I couldn't call a man and say I thought a camera had shown me something that wasn't there, and I wasn't sure whether it had actually happened. I sat there with the phone in my hand and thought about Wayne's house. The quiet at dinner had gotten bad before I admitted to myself it had gotten bad. Wayne would ask one question about my day. I'd answer. His wife would clear a plate or wipe the counter harder than she needed to. Then the TV would go on, not loud, just loud enough to keep anybody from having to say much else. Later on, after everybody went to bed, I'd hear the low part of an argument through the kitchen wall. Nothing thrown, nothing dramatic. Just the tone people use when they've already had the same conversation too many times. My name never had to come through clearly for me to know when it did. Wayne had given me room when I needed it. I knew that. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't even impatient. But that didn't change what it felt like to be 31 years old and listening to a married couple fight around the fact that you were still sleeping in the back room. I turned the phone over in my hand and pictured myself loading the truck again in daylight, driving back down off the ridge, then pulling into Wayne's driveway before supper with all my things still in bins because I'd lasted one night. I put the phone down, not because I felt brave, because I felt stuck. I told myself I'd give it one more night. That was how I said it. Not that I believed Burke's page, not that I was committing to the place. Just one more night, because quitting that fast meant giving up the cabin, and I wasn't ready to do that over a shift I still couldn't prove had really gone wrong. I slept a few hours, not well. The kind of sleep where you keep surfacing without fully waking, then dropping again before you can tell how much time has passed. When I got up, the cabin looked better than it had in the morning, maybe because I'd decided I was staying, at least for another shift. I made coffee in the little machine I'd brought with me. I sat at the bolted table and drank it looking out the small window toward the control building. In daylight, the whole place lost some of what it had carried at night. The towers looked like metal and maintenance instead of distance and shadow. The fence looked ordinary. The gravel lot looked like any other gravel lot that never got enough traffic to pack in smooth. I caught myself thinking, maybe that was all I needed. One bad first night. New place, new road, no sleep, old systems, mountain noise. Plenty of jobs feel wrong before they feel normal. That was enough to get me through the walk back up to the control room for night 2. Andrew was there when I came in. He wasn't behind the monitor wall or buried in any of the equipment. He was standing at the side counter with a paper cup and a file folder open in front of him, reading with the kind of attention that doesn't actually stop anything else from registering in the room. He looked younger than Burke, neater too. Not polished exactly, just less worn into the place. He glanced up when he heard me come in. "You sticking around?" Andrew asked. "Yeah," I said. "Good," he said. "We've had trouble keeping nights filled." That was it. He didn't ask how my first shift went. He didn't ask whether Burke had shown me enough. He didn't ask if I liked the cabin. He just said it the way a man says he's glad a slot on the schedule won't need filling again this week. He left before full dark, and I took over. Night 2 should have felt better than the first one. In some ways it did. I knew where the keys were, knew where the scrap paper sat, knew which chair wheel caught on the seam in the floor if I pushed back too fast. I knew the order of the cameras without checking. I knew the route outside, at least on paper. Even the radio hiss sounded more like background noise than something trying to get my attention. The first radio check came right on time. Beep, then response, then log entry. Clean. No voice before it, no hitch in the speaker, no second of my stomach dropping for reasons I couldn't explain. The next one came clean too. At 2:15 a.m., I ran the reset and watched the feeds come back in order. 1, 2, 3. Nothing too early, nothing sharp and wrong. No part of me had to count to 3 and switch away from a screen before I wanted to. I still did the sequence carefully, but by the time it finished, I could feel something in my chest loosen that I hadn't known I'd been holding there. The camera sweeps were clean, not just ordinary. Clean in a way that almost irritated me once I noticed it. The access road stayed empty. The tower bases stayed empty. The fence line stayed empty. Even the dead patch where the floodlight fell off looked the same every time. Nothing shifted. Nothing changed. I kept waiting for the next feed to give me something to tense up at, even something small, and it never did. When it came time for the outdoor round, I followed the route exactly the way Burke had laid it out. Out the door, Tower 1, fence gate, generator shed, Tower 2, same loop back. The night air was colder than the night before, but steadier. The wind wasn't doing much. Gravel shifted under my boots in the same way every time I put my weight down. The generator shed smelled like oil and metal and nothing else. Tower 2 was just Tower 2. No shape standing ahead of me. No wrong angle in the dark. No sense that the cameras were seeing something before I got there. I came back inside feeling ridiculous in a way that was almost a relief. That was what night 2 did. It didn't frighten me. It made me start to feel embarrassed. Embarrassed that I'd almost bailed after one shift. Embarrassed that I'd sat on the edge of the bed that morning, turning my phone over like I needed rescuing from a job that, as far as the second night was concerned, was exactly what it had advertised itself to be. Long, quiet, repetitive, and lonely. Sure. But still just work. The kind you could settle into if you let yourself. By the time the next radio check came and went without a hitch, I'd started believing the thing I probably wanted to believe from the beginning. The rules worked. Maybe that was all there was to it. Maybe the folded page was just the ugly version of institutional memory. A handful of things that had happened often enough to become procedure, passed down in plain language because plain language was what got people through nights like that. Don't answer too early. Follow the route in order. Don't stare too long at something that might just be a timing error. Fine. Strange maybe, but not impossible. It was almost worse how easy that became to accept once the station gave me nothing back. The shift ran smooth all the way toward morning. Too smooth. Every task landed where it should. Every entry went into the logbook where it belonged. The cabin light outside the side camera stayed dead steady. The back step stayed empty. The service road stayed empty. No figure, no voice, no camera blinking alive ahead of the others, nothing. The whole place felt scrubbed clean of whatever had happened the night before, and I let that calm me down more than I should have. I was closing out the last of the paperwork when I reached for the scrap paper from night 1. I'd left it beside the logbook. I was sure of that. Not jammed into the book, not under the clipboard, beside it. Now it was tucked half an inch under the edge of the clipboard instead. Not much, barely enough to notice. The kind of small shift I could have caused myself without remembering. I stared at it anyway. Then I looked at the logbook and had a second, smaller hitch of uncertainty. I couldn't have said for sure whether that was the page I remembered leaving open before I stood up. I came in on the third night already feeling tense, and I hated that. It made me feel jumpy before anything had even happened. The room looked the same as it had the night before. Same monitor wall, same radio hiss sitting low under everything, same logbook on the desk, same folded page beside the clipboard. Nothing in the station was doing anything wrong yet, and I still caught myself listening too hard when I shut the door behind me. I signed in, set my keys down, and checked the desk the same way I had the night before. Scrap paper by the logbook, pen where I wanted it, flashlight on the left side of the console. I ran the first camera sweep while there was still a little light hanging on outside. Fence line, building wall, cabin path, lower road, shed, tower base, all clean. I told myself to quit acting like the room was about to hand me something just because it had once already. Then the dark settled in, and at the top of the hour I reached for the mic. My radio cracked. "Cold Branch copy," he said over the radio. It wasn't just the timing this time, it was the cadence, the flat little pause after the station name, the way the last word dropped off. I'd heard that exact shape come out of my own mouth the night before. It was mine, or close enough that my skin knew it before my head caught up. My voice caught before I answered. "That's not me," I said. No one answered. Then the real beep hit the speaker. I sat there with my hand still on the mic, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. The hiss flattened back out. The console light stayed steady. The monitors kept showing the same dead pieces of ground they'd been showing all evening. I answered after the beep because I didn't know what else to do. I logged the time. I forced my hand not to hurry. Then I sat back and stared at the radio for a few seconds too long. That was when it stopped feeling like signal bleed. Bad timing, maybe. Bad equipment, maybe. But not that. Not after hearing it borrow the exact rhythm I'd used myself. I kept moving because the job kept moving. That was the trap of a place like that. There was always another check to do, another line to fill in, another sweep. You could stay procedural long after your nerves had already started slipping because the shift didn't care whether you were steady or not. It just kept coming due. The first full camera sweep after that started out clean. Front gate, building side, cabin path, lower road, fence line. Then I hit the next outdoor feed, and there it was again. A figure at the edge of the road near the bottom rise below Tower 1. Not clear, never clear, just the same upright wrongness standing where empty ground should have been. Not moving, not even looking like it needed to move. Just there, waiting in a place the monitor wall wasn't supposed to have anything human in it at that hour. I felt my hand twitch toward the zoom before I stopped it. Then I reached for the scrap paper and wrote the time down. My fingers didn't feel right, not numb, just a little slow, like they were working through cold even though the room wasn't cold enough for that. I moved to the next feed because that was the order. The fence line came up, and it was there again. Same shape, same stillness. I hit the next camera, the gravel by the generator shed, and it was there too. By the third feed, it was too far ahead. It should not have been able to get there that fast, not if it had been a person, not if it had been anything moving in a way I understood. I didn't even have enough time between screens to tell myself a lie that felt decent. That was the first moment the route in my head and the route on the screens stopped lining up. I wrote the second time down. I kept going. Had to. That was the whole rule. Don't zoom. Don't compare. Keep the sweep moving. But my breathing had changed by then. I could hear it in the room, too loud against the radio hiss and the little fan noise from the rack cabinets. I finished the sequence, came back around, and the first feed was empty again. Not empty like it had stepped away just in time for me to miss it. Empty like it had never needed to be there for long in the first place. I checked the clock. The outside round was coming due. That was when Rule 5 stopped being words on a folded page and turned into a wall. If the figure appears on 2 consecutive feeds in the same sweep, don't go outside for 10 minutes. I sat there looking at the time block for the round, then at the scrap paper, then back at the monitor wall. The job said it was time to move. The rule said, don't. Not maybe don't. Don't. I hated how fast I believed the rule. Not all the way, not in some big dramatic sense, but enough to stay in the chair. So I waited. That was the start of the shift falling out of alignment. 10 minutes doesn't sound like much until you're sitting alone in a control room on a mountain, trying not to look too long at any one feed, because you already know something is using the order against you. I kept the sweep moving. I logged the checks that still had to be logged. I watched the clock pull farther away from where the outside round should have started. Every minute I sat there, the shift felt a little less like the one I was supposed to be working. I could feel it happening. The same way you can feel a shirt seam twist under your arm before you can fix it. Small at first, then impossible not to notice. When the 10 minutes were up, I stood too fast and had to put a hand on the desk until the room stopped leaning. I grabbed the flashlight, the keys, and the radio. Then I stopped again and looked at the route map pinned beside the monitor wall. Tower 1, fence gate, generator shed, Tower 2. I'd been treating that order like work efficiency, a way of not forgetting steps, a way of keeping the paperwork neat. Standing there with the keys biting into my palm, I had the first ugly sense that it was more than that. Not protective exactly, more like spacing, timing, a way of keeping yourself from arriving somewhere at the same moment something else did. I went out anyway. The night air hit colder than it had the night before. Not just temperature. It felt thinner, like the sound got farther once I stepped outside. The gravel under my boots seemed too loud at first, then not loud enough. I shut the door behind me and started toward Tower 1, keeping the flashlight low. The beam caught the same things it had every other time. Fence posts, broken stone, the edge of the road, the pale strip of dust on the path where the truck tires had dried it. Nothing in front of me, nothing waiting at the tower base. But by the time I reached it, I had the wrong feeling in my body already. Not fear exactly, more like I was late to my own steps. The radio gave a burst of static against my shoulder. Then I heard footfalls, not from the ground, from the speaker, a crunch of gravel, then another, measured, too close. I stopped walking and the sound came one step later, as if whatever I was hearing had not gotten the message yet. I stared at the radio on my shoulder like that would help. Then I forced myself to move again. One step, two. The speaker gave me another faint crunch before my boot hit the gravel under me. I swallowed and kept going. At the fence gate, I looked back toward the control building. The exterior light was where it should have been. The door was where it should have been. The angle felt wrong anyway. When I checked that camera from inside, the gate always looked closer to the building than it felt from the path. Now it felt farther. Not by a lot, just enough that I caught myself thinking I'd taken a wrong turn on a route that didn't even offer one. I went on to the generator shed. Its steel door came up out of the dark exactly where it belonged. I checked the lock. Fine. I checked the housing. Fine. The smell of oil and old heat sat thick around it. But when I glanced up toward where I knew Tower 2 stood, the distance between them looked stretched out in a way I couldn't settle in my head. Not changed exactly, just reluctant, like the ridge had gone longer while I wasn't looking. I kept hearing little scraps of myself arrive out of order, my breath louder in the radio after I'd already exhaled, a step that sounded one beat early, the click of my flashlight hand shifting grip before I felt my fingers move. By the time I reached Tower 2, I knew the route order had never been about convenience. It was there to keep a man from cutting across his own path, or somebody else's. I did not linger there. I turned back for the building with that same careful pace I'd been using all night, because the part of me that still wanted to stay functional understood something simple. If I ran, I would lose count. If I lost count, I would lose the order. And if I lost the order, I didn't know what exactly I'd be giving up, but I knew enough not to try it. The control room felt smaller when I stepped back inside. Not physically, just in the way all lit rooms do after you've been out in the dark too long. I shut the door, set the keys down, and looked at the desk. The logbook was still open. Only now there were more lines on the page than there had been when I went out. I knew that before I crossed the room. Knew it from the shape of the handwriting, from the way the entries sat on the paper, from the pressure in the downstrokes. My stomach turned over so hard I had to brace one hand against the desk before I leaned in close enough to read. The writing was mine. Not similar. Not close. Mine. One line marked the time I had stepped outside. Another marked the fence gate. Another the generator shed. The next line had the time I'd come back in. Clean block letters, same spacing I used, same ugly little hitch in the way I made my sevens. Below that was one more line, only half finished, like whoever had written it had been interrupted. It ended just after the time block for the next round. I stood there staring at the half-finished line until it stopped reading like a line and started looking like proof. Same pressure, same spacing, same way I crowded the time too close to the dash when I wrote fast. Mine. I shut the logbook, opened it again, and the line was still there. My hands were shaking now, not bad, just enough to make the paper whisper when I touched the edge of the page. I checked the clock. Then I checked the scrap paper. Then I looked back at the monitor wall. The room had started feeling too small for the number of things in it. Radio hiss, fan noise, my own breathing, the little tick from the baseboard heater in the back hall. All of it too close together. I tried to pin the shift down in my head. Radio check, sweep, wait, outside round, back in, log entry. That was the order. That had been the order since I got there. But the more I tried to hold it still, the more the pieces moved on me. Had I checked the generator shed once tonight or twice? I knew I'd gone there. I could still smell the oil and old metal in the air around it. I could still feel the cold off the handle when I tested the lock. But that could have been 10 minutes ago. Or it could have been the first outside round from the night before, layered over this one, because the path was the same, and the motions were the same, and my body had started treating them like copies instead of separate events. I looked toward the control room door and had the same problem. I knew I'd shut it when I came back in. I could remember the pull of it and the sound the latch made when it caught, but I could also remember doing that on the previous round, and the round before that. Same hand, same motion, same sound. One memory laid right on top of another until none of them felt clean anymore. That was when the thing underneath the fear finally showed itself. It wasn't just that something was in the system. It was that the shift had started making room for it by wearing me down into pattern. Same chair, same route, same checks, same lines in the book, same door opening and shutting, every pass through the night taking a little more of the edge off what was mine and what was just repeated. I thought about the cabin next door, not in some sentimental way, just the plain facts of it. My duffel on the floor, my coffee maker on the little table, my boots by the door, the blanket at the foot of the bed. Stupid, small things, cheap things. But they'd started feeling like mine because they stayed where I left them, because nobody else was using that sink. Nobody else was setting a plate down too hard in the next room. Nobody else was having a low, tired fight through a kitchen wall while I lay there pretending not to hear it. I'd wanted that place so badly I'd talked myself through the first night, then through the second. I'd told myself the rules worked. I'd told myself I could handle the road, the dark, the hours, the silence, all of it. If it meant I didn't have to go back down the mountain and walk into Wayne's house with my bins and my duffel and my apologetic face all over again. That was what this thing had found, not some grand secret, just the ugliest plain thing in me, that I needed this place more than I wanted to admit, that I wanted it badly enough to keep following the same cycle, even after I knew something in that cycle was learning me. The radio gave a burst of static so sharp it made me flinch. Then Burke's voice came through, thin under the hiss, but still his. "You don't get to keep it by letting it finish," Burke said over the radio. "Finish what?" I asked. No answer right away, just the static and my own pulse in my ears. I kept my eyes on the monitor wall while I waited. I don't know why. Maybe because looking away felt worse. The outdoor feeds were empty again. Fence line, lower road, tower base. The same dead places they'd always been. But by then, I knew better than to trust empty when it came in the middle of a cycle. I checked the clock again and had to stop myself from reaching for the route map like I hadn't already memorized it. Another round was coming due. The thought of going back outside made my throat tighten, not because I thought something was waiting in the dark to jump me. It was uglier than that. I was starting to think that every time I completed the route exactly the way the station wanted, I was helping it along, giving it another clean pass to line itself up with me, another chance to get the spacing right, another chance to finish whatever had started when I heard my own cadence come through the radio. I looked at the logbook again. The half-finished line sat there like it was waiting for me to make it true. That was when the fear changed shape. Up to then, it had still been about what might happen to me if I got something wrong, if I answered too soon, if I looked too long, if I stepped outside at the wrong moment, still fear in the ordinary sense. Something bad catches up to you. Something bad finds you out there in the dark. Now it felt different. Now it felt like the danger wasn't that it would catch me. It was that it would get the whole pattern of me down so well that catching me wouldn't matter anymore. The route, the checks, the time blocks, the handwriting, the way I keyed the mic, the way I pushed out of the chair, the way I shut the door behind me when I came back in. A version of me, completed inside the station by repetition. And if that happened, then what was I, exactly? The man who took the job because it came with a cabin? The man trying not to end up back in somebody else's spare room? The man sweating over a logbook at 3 a.m? Or just the unfinished version that got here first? I put both hands flat on the desk and leaned over until my shoulders hurt. The room smelled like hot dust and old coffee and the sweat that had dried into the collar of my work shirt. My mouth tasted stale. My eyes burned. Somewhere through the wall, the heater in the cabin kicked once and stopped again. That sound almost got me more than anything else. Just that little reminder that the place next door was still there, still holding my things, still mine for as long as I could keep the job. That was the pressure, immediate, mean, simple. If I lost the job, I lost the cabin. If I stayed in the cycle long enough to keep it, I might lose the part of me that had wanted it in the first place. I stood there another few seconds, trying to get one clean thought in line after another, and failing. The rounds had started bleeding together too badly for that. I could no longer tell whether I was remembering what I'd already done or what the station expected me to do next. And that, more than the figure on the cameras, more than the voice before the beep, was what made the whole thing feel close. Not that I might die up there, that something in that room was getting close to being more completely me than I was. I stayed bent over the desk for a few more seconds, palms flat against the metal edge, trying to slow my breathing down enough to think in a straight line. That was the problem by then. The night had started taking straight lines away from me. I looked at the radio first, then the monitor wall, then the logbook, then the route map pinned beside the console. Same 4 things I'd been moving between since my first night there. Same order, more or less, same pattern. And that was the first time the whole thing locked together in my head in a way that made me wish it hadn't. The voice before the beep, the figure in the next feed, the route outside, the lines in the logbook already waiting for me in my own hand. None of it had been random. If it had been random, it wouldn't have stayed inside the work. It wouldn't have kept showing up at the exact places where the shift repeated itself. It wouldn't have needed the radio checks or the camera order or the outside route or the logbook. It would have just done whatever it was going to do. Instead, it kept meeting me inside the pattern. That was what made the rules make sense in the worst possible way. I picked up the folded page again and read through it one more time, slower than I had before. Not looking for comfort, just looking for what I'd missed. Only answer after the second beep. If the next feed already shows someone where you haven't gotten yet, if the figure appears on 2 consecutive feeds, if the logbook already contains something in your handwriting that you haven't written yet, they weren't rules for fighting anything. They weren't rules for keeping the station clean of it. They were markers, measurements, the only way a man on nights could tell how far inside the cycle things had already slipped. I looked back at the half-finished line in the logbook and felt my stomach turn again. That one was the worst. Not because it was the strangest, because it changed the meaning of everything that came before it. A voice could still be bad signal if you were desperate enough. A figure on a camera could still be timing, shadow, distance, lack of sleep. But once it wrote in my hand, that excuse was gone. That meant it wasn't just watching the work happen, it was inside the shape of it, inside the order of it, close enough to me to start laying down the next step before I took it. Rule 6 wasn't there because the logbook was dangerous. It was there because once the handwriting matched, the shift was no longer fully mine. I reached for the radio and stopped halfway. My hand just hung there for a second. Not because I thought touching it would do something, because I was suddenly too aware of how many times I'd already done that same motion. Reach, key up, answer, set it down, log the time, same rhythm, same timing, enough times for something to learn it. The radio hiss rose and flattened again. Then Burke came back over it, thinner this time, like the signal had farther to travel than it should have. Burke took a second before answering. "The rules don't stop it." "Then what do?" I asked. "They tell you which round is still yours," he said. That was answer enough. I stared at the monitor wall after that and let what he'd said settle where it wanted to. Which round is still yours. Not which part is safe. Not how to beat it. Not how to make it go away. Just which round still belonged to me. That turned the whole job inside out. At the start, routine had meant safety in the normal sense. Do the checks in order, keep the station running, keep the logs clean, don't forget anything. Routine was what made the work manageable. That was how I'd been looking at it from the first drive up the mountain. If I learned the rhythm, I could keep the job. If I kept the job, I kept the cabin. Simple. Now routine meant something else. Routine was how it kept getting closer to matching me. The radio gave it timing. The camera sweep gave it sequence. The outside route gave it distance. The logbook gave it proof. Every repeated motion narrowed the gap a little more. Every pass through the same cycle gave it another chance to get ahead of me in exactly the right way. That was why the route order mattered. It wasn't some old man preference from Burke. It wasn't just the neatest way to cover the grounds. It was spacing. If I followed the same order and caught the pattern slipping, I could still tell where I was in relation to it. Break the order, and I'd lose that. I'd stop knowing whether I was behind it, ahead of it, or about to walk straight into the same point from the other side. That was why the camera rule mattered too. Don't zoom. Don't compare. Because comparison was exactly what it wanted. The more detail I tried to fix in my head, the more I would start treating it like part of the same known sequence, part of the same job. Another point on the sweep. Another thing to verify. Another line to complete. The rules weren't asking me to ignore it. They were keeping me from helping it settle further into the pattern. Night 1 had been recognition. That part was clear now. It had tested the edges first, the voice before the beep, the camera that came back too early. One figure and one feed, gone by the time I came back around. Enough to see me moving through the station, enough to map the cycle without giving itself away cleanly. Night 2 had been synchronization. No scare, no visible push, nothing dramatic at all. Just the whole station running so smoothly I'd started relaxing into it. That was the night it got the rhythm clean. My rhythm. The way I answered, the way I logged things, the way I moved from screen to screen and room to room when I thought nothing was wrong. Night 3 was completion, not complete yet. I understood that too, but close enough that the logbook had started writing ahead of me. That was the real meaning of being ahead of me, not just appearing farther up the road or in the next camera. It was ahead of me in the cycle itself, ahead in the order of things, ahead in the shift. If I stayed inside it long enough, the station would have a version of me that matched the timing better than I did. I looked at the unfinished line again. It wasn't trying to replace me in some broad, theatrical way. That had been too big, too dramatic, too easy to dismiss. It was more precise than that. It was finishing the part of me the station needed. The operator. The man who answered on time, moved in order, checked the route, made the entries, shut the door, opened the next round, kept the pattern going. A version of me better aligned to the station than the one still standing there shaking over the desk. I don't know how long I stood there thinking that. Not long. It only felt long because once the logic came together, it made every earlier moment heavier all at once. The first voice over the radio. The first shape in the next feed. The second night being clean enough to make me stay. None of those things had been separate. They had been steps. By then I understood the station wasn't just where it was happening. The station was how it was happening. Not all of it. I'm not saying the building wanted anything. I'm saying the system gave it structure, a way to sync, a way to move in rounds, a way to get ahead of a man by teaching itself the exact shape of his work until he could no longer tell whether he was still running the shift or just fulfilling it. The monitor wall cycled through the same empty ground again. Fence, road, gravel, tower base, everything looked normal in that flat, washed-out way it always had. That was what made it worse. The cycle still looked usable, still looked ordinary enough that another part of me wanted to go right back into it and keep working, because work was what I knew how to do when I was scared. That was the trap, too. If I kept following the cycle exactly as laid out, I wouldn't be preserving myself. I'd be giving it more of me to line up with, more timing, more motion, more proof. The rules had never promised safety. Hey were warning signs, a way to tell how far the shift had already gone bad before you admitted it had. Ways to tell whether I was still in my own round or already standing in one it had gotten to first. And by then, with my voice borrowed over the radio and my handwriting waiting in the book, I knew I was almost out of road. Once I understood what the rules were really doing, I knew I couldn't keep leaning on them and hope to get out clean. They had gotten me that far. They had kept me from answering too early, from staring too long, from stepping out at the wrong time. But they were only buying me room. They were never going to stop what was happening. If I stayed inside the shift and kept moving with it, all I was doing was giving it more chances to line itself up with me. Another radio check, another sweep, another round outside, another line in the book, more pattern, more sync. So I stopped trying to survive the shift. I started trying to break it. Cold Branch ran on repetition, the radio checks, the camera sweep, the reset at 2:15 a.m., the route outside, even the way the room sounded after midnight. If that thing was using the station to get ahead of me, then the station was the only thing I still had any real leverage over. I went to the console first. I killed the radio auto check. Then I took the camera sweep out of automatic cycle. Then I locked out the reset sequence so it couldn't come back on the next pass. None of it was one dramatic move. It was just switch after switch, confirmation light after confirmation light, the kind of work that would have felt routine if the monitor wall hadn't been hanging there behind me like another set of eyes. The logbook was still open on the desk. I looked at it once, and that was enough. There were more lines in it. Same pressure in the letters, same ugly little hitch in the sevens, same spacing I always used when I was writing too fast and trying to keep it neat anyway. One line marked the radio auto check going down before I had even finished flipping the switch. Another marked the camera cycle dropping. The next line had already started describing the manual shutdown sequence I was only halfway through. That almost got me. Not because I was surprised. By then I was past surprise. It got me because it made the whole thing feel settled, like I was just stepping into something that had already been written in the right hand at the right time. For one bad second, I thought maybe the shutdown was part of it too. Maybe I was still inside the same pattern, just further along than I wanted to admit. Then I checked the monitors. The feeds were still live, just no longer cycling on their own. In one of the lower road cameras, the figure was there again. No face, no detail, just that same upright shape, too still, too exact. I switched manually to the next camera, closer to the building. I switched again, closer. It still wasn't rushing. That was what made it worse. It didn't need to rush. It was moving with the same patience the station had used on me since the first night, like it already knew where I would be and when. I kept going. Cold Branch had a full shutdown path for emergencies, but it wasn't one button. It was a chain. Drop the external timing handoff, isolate the backup loop, force the relay load down, cut the remaining sequence controls, then the final shutdown, the one that took the whole place dark and silent until a day crew could bring it back the long way. I moved to the secondary panel and started working through it. The radio hiss thinned, then broke up, then came back weak and ugly through the speaker. The room felt larger for half a second, then too small again. I could hear my own breathing, I could hear the wall fan, I could hear the little tick from the heater in the back hall. That was about it. I looked back at the monitors. The figure had moved again, one camera closer than it had been. Still no face, still no sudden move, just nearer. The logbook had another line waiting for me. It described my hand reaching for the final cutoff. I looked at it, then at the panel. If the shutdown had already become part of the thing's pattern, I was done anyway. If it hadn't, then this was the only move I had left. I wasn't going back outside. I wasn't making another round. I wasn't giving it one more clean cycle to finish learning me. So I pulled the cutoff. Everything changed at once, but not loudly. That's what stayed with me. No blast, no shower of sparks, just the station going dead in stages. The monitors went dark one by one, the outer feeds first, then the building angles, then the hallway. The status lights on the rack cabinets dropped from green to amber to nothing. The radio hiss cut off so clean it felt like pressure leaving my skull. Even the room itself sounded different right away, like the walls had been holding something they didn't have to hold anymore. Then it was quiet. Real quiet. The kind you only get when a place has been cut off on purpose. I stood there with my hand still on the panel and listened to it. No footsteps in the speaker, no sweep clicks, no hum under the walls, just the wind outside and my own breath trying to slow down. The figure was gone with the feeds. That was all I got. No clean proof, no last reveal. Just the cycle broken, the station dead, and the room no longer able to keep carrying whatever had been using it. By daylight, none of that mattered on paper. What mattered was that I had shut down a live relay site without authorization. Andrew came up with the others after the outage rolled far enough to get attention. There were forms, questions, a review, equipment loss, service interruption, procedure violations. They wanted reasons that fit in a report. They wanted something that sounded like a bad call from a tired night tech. The truth would have sounded worse than useless. Andrew didn't look up from the report. You shut down a live site without authorization. I let that sit there. Yeah, I said. That was the version that stuck. I lost the job, which meant I lost the cabin. I had 3 days to clear my things out. That was enough time to pack the same bins back into the truck, strip the bed, dump the last of the coffee grounds out of the little machine, and realize how fast a place stops being yours once somebody higher up decides it never really was. I didn't go back to Wayne's house. I found something else, smaller and worse, and paid too much for it because I didn't have many choices left. What stayed with me wasn't just losing the job. My timing never really went back to normal after Cold Branch. I wake up before alarms now. I reach for the phone before it rings. I look at a door before somebody knocks. Every now and then I hear my name in the room just before somebody actually says it, and for one bad second, I'm back in front of that radio trying not to answer too soon. The last part hit when I was moving out of the cabin. There was a shallow drawer under the table. I hadn't used it. When I pulled it open to make sure I wasn't leaving anything behind, I found a folded page inside. Same size as Burke's, same pale crease marks. It was a new set of rules, shorter. The first line was enough. If you hear Merritt Cain's voice on the radio before the second beep, do not answer. That was when I understood the shutdown hadn't ended it clean. It had only cut it off from the old cycle. Whatever stayed behind at Cold Branch had lost the system it was using, but not everything it had already learned. That's the part I still live with. Not just that I shut the place down, not just that I lost the job. Something up there learned my timing well enough to keep part of me.